midnight. Autumn 1943. A convoy of trucks rattles down a dusty road in the American Midwest. Their cargo is not supplies or weapons, but men, tired, bruised, defeated men of the German Wehrmacht. Just weeks earlier, they were in Tunisia, watching Rommel's Afrika Korps collapse under relentless Allied pressure. Now they are prisoners, shipped across an ocean they never expected to see. The gates of the POW camp creak open. Floodlights blaze down, casting long shadows across the barbed wire. The prisoners shuffle out, whispering nervously. Some expect abuse, others fear starvation. Propaganda had painted the Americans as savages, undisciplined, uncultured, and incapable of understanding the proud German soldier. But then, something happens that none of them were prepared for. An American guard steps forward. His uniform is clean, his boots polished, his rifle slung casually across his shoulder. He clears his throat and greets them in perfect German. Willkommen in Ihrem neuen Zuhause, mein Herren. Welcome to your new home, gentlemen. The words hang in the cold night air. The prisoners freeze, stunned. This was not the broken, laughable German they had expected from an enemy. This was flawless, down to the intonation of a Swabian village schoolmaster. One prisoner whispers, spricht besser Deutsch als ich. He speaks better German than I do. And in that instant, a seed of fear takes root. If the Americans could steal their language, the very soul of their identity, what else could they take? For German soldiers, their language was sacred. It was the language of Goethe and Schiller, of Wagner's operas and Prussian command drills. To hear it flowing effortlessly from the mouth of the enemy was unsettling, almost insulting. What they didn't know was that the U.S. Army had prepared for this moment years earlier. In 1942, as America entered the war, the military quietly began recruiting thousands of German-speaking immigrants. Many were Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution. Others were German Americans who had grown up speaking the language at home. They weren't just fluent, they were native. They knew every dialect, every colloquialism, every bit of barracks slang. They could tell if a man was from Hamburg or Bavaria just by the way he swore. The effect on prisoners was devastating. A captured sergeant once muttered under his breath that the Americans were Dummkopf, idiots. The guard turned, grinned, and replied in the same Bavarian dialect. Du bist hier der einzige Dummkopf. You're the only idiot here. The group went silent. Fear spread faster than barbed wire. Prisoners began to suspect that every word they spoke was overheard, every whisper understood. Jokes about Hitler, gripes about rations, even private confessions, all could be weapons in American hands. And the U.S. Army encouraged this paranoia. Interrogators let slip details of recent battles, making it seem like they had inside spies. In truth, much of it came from nothing more than overhearing German conversations in the camp. The Germans had entered captivity thinking themselves superior. But with each passing day, they realized the Americans were not only stronger on the battlefield, they were smarter, more prepared, and more dangerous in ways they had never imagined. It wasn't just about intelligence gathering. The Americans understood something deeper: psychology. German officers relied heavily on hierarchy and secrecy. Orders flowed downward, questions were not asked. But inside the POW camps, that chain of command unraveled. Why? Because the Americans could speak directly to the rank and file. Guards would casually chat with ordinary soldiers, slipping in news of the war that the German officers desperately wanted to conceal. When Stalingrad fell in February 1943, it wasn't German commanders who told their men. It was American guards, speaking perfect German, reading from American newspapers. The effect was shattering. Propaganda had promised endless victories, yet here was undeniable proof of disaster, delivered by the enemy, in their own tongue. Prisoners began to question their officers. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was Hitler lying to them? Was the war already lost? The barbed wire kept their bodies confined, but it was the language barrier, or rather, the lack of one, that broke their spirit. One German lieutenant later admitted in an interrogation report. It was not the food, nor the fences, nor the guards that defeated us in the camps. It was their German. They knew us better than we knew ourselves. Among the most feared figures in the camps were the American interrogators. Many were German Jews who had fled Nazi persecution, men who had lost family in the Holocaust. Now, wearing U.S. uniforms, they faced the very soldiers of the regime that had hunted them. They were called the Ritchie Boys, trained at Camp Ritchie, Maryland. These men weren't just fluent, they were masters of psychological manipulation. They knew how to push buttons. A Bavarian accent here, a Prussian insult there, a casual mention of a soldier's hometown, it all created the illusion of omniscience. One famous Ritchie boy interrogator, Hans Have, would deliberately mispronounce a single German word in front of prisoners. When they corrected him, he'd laugh and say, "Thank you. Every word you give me is another weapon for my country." The Germans never knew if they were facing an ordinary guard or a trained spy. And that uncertainty ate at them night after night. Day by day, the German POWs began to adapt to life in captivity. Camps in America were, by Geneva Convention standards, humane. Prisoners were fed, housed, even allowed to form orchestras, play soccer, and publish camp newspapers. But the psychological pressure never lifted. When a German soldier muttered something about escaping, a guard would respond with a casual reminder. "The forests around here are bigger than the Black Forest, and we'll hear you long before you get far." When officers tried to enforce Nazi loyalty, guards simply spoke directly to the enlisted men in German, bypassing the chain of command entirely. Authority collapsed, discipline crumbled, and men who once fought side by side now distrusted each other. For many, the most haunting realization was that the Americans weren't just stronger, they were familiar. They knew German songs, German jokes, even German childhood rhymes. It was as if their captors could peer straight into their souls. The Nazi regime had sold its soldiers a myth that they were culturally, intellectually, and militarily superior to all others. But in the American camps, that illusion was destroyed. Here were Americans, farmers, factory workers, immigrants, who spoke their language with precision, who read their books, who knew their history. And unlike the Germans, they didn't use that knowledge to build walls of superiority. They used it to break walls down. Prisoners who once mocked the stupid Americans now sat in silence, realizing they had underestimated their enemy at every turn. As one captured officer later confessed, "We thought we were the wolves, and they the sheep. But inside those camps, we learned we were the ones in the pen, and they were the hunters." When the war ended, most German POWs returned home. But they carried with them an experience few spoke about, the unsettling memory of being defeated not only by bombs and bullets, but by words. American mastery of German inside the camps was a quiet victory, rarely written in history books, yet it had profound consequences. It broke morale, shattered illusions, and turned prisoners into unwilling witnesses of Nazi lies. The lesson endures to this day. Wars are not only fought with weapons, but with understanding. To know an enemy's language is to know his thoughts, his fears, his humanity, and to turn them into tools of victory. And so, long after the tanks rusted and the guns fell silent, the most terrifying memory for thousands of German soldiers remained the same. The night the guards smiled, and spoke to them in perfect German. Every prisoner dreams of escape. For the German POWs, the idea of slipping past the watchtowers and running free into the American countryside seemed like the ultimate act of defiance. But the reality was different. The camps were located deep in the American heartland, Nebraska, Texas, Alabama. Surrounding them were endless miles of farmland, forests, and deserts. Even if a man slipped through the wire, where could he go? And worse, the guards spoke German. A farmer in Iowa might not know a single word of German, but the army guards certainly did. Any accent, any slip, any attempt at disguise could be exposed instantly. Prisoners quickly realized that escape wasn't just about fences. It was about outsmarting men who understood them better than they understood themselves. Still, some tried. One group in Arizona tunneled under a barracks, only to be discovered when an American guard overheard them whispering about der Tunnel. Another group in Texas attempted to build a raft to float down the Red River, but gave themselves away when a German-speaking cook casually asked how the rafting lessons were going. The result? Very few ever made it far. For most, escape became nothing more than a fantasy whispered in the dark, and even those whispers were never safe. As weeks turned to months, something unexpected began to happen. The Germans, many of whom had grown up under strict Nazi propaganda, began to see America with their own eyes, not through Hitler's lens, but through lived experience. They were shocked. The decadent, weak America they had been promised did not exist. Instead, they saw abundance, food served in proper portions, medical care provided even to the enemy, guards who joked and smiled instead of barking orders. For the first time, they tasted Coca-Cola. They listened to jazz and swing drifting from the camp loudspeakers. They watched American baseball games. For young men raised in a dictatorship that demanded blind obedience, this glimpse of freedom was intoxicating. One prisoner later wrote in his memoir, "In Germany, we had been told the Americans were barbarians. But in the camps, we discovered they were people like us, only freer, only richer, only happier. And that was the most dangerous revelation of all." This cultural shock softened some prisoners, hardened others. But one truth became impossible to ignore: the Nazi image of America was a lie. And that realization planted doubts that no propaganda could erase. By 1945, over 425,000 German POWs had been held in the United States. Most never saw combat again. But their time in captivity left scars and lessons. For the US, the ability to speak to their prisoners in flawless German was a quiet, almost invisible victory. It never made headlines. It wasn't celebrated with medals or parades. Yet its impact was immense. It destroyed the enemy's confidence. It broke the myth of German superiority. It turned barbed wire camps into psychological battlefields. When the war ended and the prisoners were shipped back to Germany, they carried with them haunting memories, not of brutal guards or cruel punishments, but of Americans who spoke like their brothers, who understood their secrets, who dismantled their illusions with nothing more than words. In the end, the language itself was the weapon. And for many German POWs, that was more terrifying than any rifle or bomb. As one prisoner put it years later in an interview, "We had been defeated twice, once by their armies and once by their words. The second was the harder to endure,